I'm here to teach foundation paper piecing to make the economy block. So this is just a 6-inch version. You're going to need to make 4 of these to make your 12-inch block. All the details for the fabric and the cutting is in a separate PDF, so make sure you've downloaded that, and then that'll have all your instructions on it for cutting. And we're going to be sewing through a paper template. That's what foundation paper piecing is, and it's a really accurate way of sewing. It gets those seam points just right. So I hope you enjoy making this block with me. So to make our economy block, we're going to need the pattern template printed off, and that's available on the Crafty Monkeys website as a PDF download. And I've trimmed it down so that it's another 1/4 inch outside of the seam allowance. It just gives us a bit of extra room. Make sure when you print it, you're printing at 100%, and this square here with the solid line measures 6 inch by 6 inches. And I printed this on a pattern trace foundation paper piecing paper, or you can just use really thin printer paper. Then we've got the fabrics. This is for our centre square. So I've got a fussy cut here with this dove in the centre, and this measures 4 inches by 4 inches. Then we've got 2 squares, each are 3.5 by 3.5 inches, and they're cut along the diagonal to make triangles. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 triangles, and then another 2 squares cut along the diagonal. These are 4.5 by 4.5 inches, and the measurements for all these bits of fabric are on the Crafty Monkeys website. Then we've got some extra bits of equipment that are really helpful. A postcard, that's really useful, or you could use any bit of card as long as it's got a straight edge. A glue stick. This is a fabric glue stick, but Pritt stick would work as well, or we can use a pin. This is just to hold the first piece of fabric down. Then I've got some different sorts of rulers. This is a specialist ruler. It's called an 1/4, and it's really useful for foundation paper piecing. I'll show you why very soon. But it's got a little lip on the edge, and it's safer to use really. But you can use, this is a standard little quilt ruler, and I've got a 6.5 inch ruler here. Either of those would work as well. A rotary cutter. And then I've got a couple of tools. These are like little extras. This is a finger press. You put your finger there and then you can press seams open. And that's a seam roller. Again, it's for pressing, and you just roll along the seam instead of having to go to the ironing board, but an iron is fine. So we're going to start with our template and the centre square. So I'm going to move these other things out of the way. And let's start with this one and the centre square. So we're going to centre this bird on this template. Now you can see it's got a little centering cross over it to help you do this. And what I'm going to do with my fabric, I'm just going to finger press it down that way to find a centre line. I'm going to finger press it the other way to find a centre line. This is a quick way to line them up. So you can just about see a light crease there. It doesn't need to be very heavy. It doesn't need an iron or anything. Right, now turn your template to the wrong side, get your glue pen and a little swipe across that cross, and I'm going to place this on top, lining up my creases, and that should have it in the centre. And if you need to check, oh, not quite, I'm going to move it over a little bit. I don't actually want it as centred, I want it over to one side a little bit, I think, to fit the tail in. That might be it. Yes, that's better. I can see that my bird's all fitting in. It's the sort of thing that you lift up to the light. I think I can see the light coming through like that. But if you're doing this, lift it up to a window and you'll see that your motif fits nicely inside this box. Right, the first thing we're going to do is take our postcard. We're going to place it between square 1 and this triangle 2, because for foundation paper piecing you work in number order, and this is all one piece that we're going to work with. There isn't another bit we're going to join together, and we're going to work just all the way through from numbers 1 through to 9. So first, place your card between 1 and 2, and this is the seam line, and fold the paper back, so nice and tight. There'll be no paper sort of loose here. It's wrapped right around the postcard. And then I'm getting my 1/4 ruler so you can see how it works. And this little hump bit is going to sit against the postcard, and you can see it just slides against it and then it won't slip around. And it's 1/4 inch over onto the fabric. It's to create a seam line that we're going to sew. If I was doing this with the normal ruler, like a standard quilt ruler, it would look like that. So it just hangs 1/4 inch over the paper that's folded back onto the fabric, and I'm going to take the rotary cutter and trim, and that's going to create our seam allowance. We can push the paper back again. Now I'm going to take one of my smaller triangles that came from the small squares. There were yellow ones for me, and they contrast nicely with the blue. Let's flip over, and I'm going to place this against the fabric, right sides together, pretty sides, printed sides in this case, together. And what I'm trying to do is line my triangle up so that that corner there and this corner here are lined up together so that they're centered really. And to hold this in place, I'm going to hold it with my fingers and just flip it to this side and put a pin through it, and that's going through the fabric. So the pin is on the paper side and it's just holding it in place so I can check that this triangle is going to cover up all of piece 2, all these lines, and extend over by 1/4 inch at least for the seam allowances. And I can see it is. I can see, look, my seam lines right back there, and on this side it's at least 1/2 inch over. That's great, that's just how we want it. Now we're ready to sew our first seam. The sewing is going to be on this side, on the paper side, not the fabric side. And we're going to sew through the paper and through the fabric. So I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine. So here we are at the machine, ready to sew the first seam. I've got a red thread on just so that you can see more easily when I'm sewing, but you can just use your normal sort of neutral colour that will disappear in. I've got a 1/4 inch foot on, not because I need a 1/4 inch seam, but because mine is open here and I'll be able to see where I'm sewing. If I place the paper underneath here, I'm going to be sewing along this line, and it's really helpful to have a foot that's open. So a clear foot is helpful as well if you've got one of those. The needle that I'm using, it's a 70. You could use a 70 or an 80 size needle. But what is important is once you've used a needle and sewn through paper, keep it aside from your other needles because it tends to blunt it. So it's useful to keep it for other foundation paper piecing. Now, the setting on my sewing machine, my stitch length about 1.5. My machine tends to sew small stitches anyway, slightly smaller than other machines I've had, but you need a small stitch length. And what I'm going to do is I'll just show you again, we've got the paper here, the fabric underneath both layers, and we're going to sew from here to here. It's the seam line between pieces 1 and 2. So I'm going to lower the needle down by hand into where the beginning of the seam starts. And this is where it helps to have that foot that you can just see into a little bit there. So it's exactly where the seam starts. Now I can put my foot down and we can sew a couple of stitches and a couple of stitches back to secure. And then we're going to sew forwards. I've got a pin holding everything in place that will slide out as we come towards it. And I'm going slow and steady exactly along this seam line here. So it's almost like a sort of sewing by numbers, isn't it? Going exactly along that line. I'm just coming up to the end and I can see, because my foot's open, I can see I'm coming to it. And I'm going to stop exactly at the end. In fact, I'm hand turning that last bit. And if you go 1 stitch over, it doesn't matter, or even 2 stitches, but it's better if you can to sew exactly to the seam. What you don't want to do is be a stitch under, because you'll end up with holes and you don't want that. So I'll sew 1 stitch over. And then I'm going to go back, just finish that seam a little bit, trim my threads. When I trim the threads, I trim so there's about a 1/4 inch tail on them. I don't like to trim less than that because it can encourage the stitches to come undone. And that seam is sewn. If I turn it to this side, you can see that triangle is now attached. So you can take that to iron, press this side first, and then press this open, and make sure that you press this really open. It doesn't want to be a bit creased over like that with a fold of fabric underneath. It needs to be pressed nice and flat. So I'll see you back at the cutting mat. So that's our first seam sewn, and you can see it there in red, and we've pressed it back. This is the finger press again, so instead of pressing with an iron, you can use this to press the fabric back. It's really handy when you're working on these blocks and you don't want to break up your sort of activity too much by moving to an ironing board. So that's what that one is for. Right, that side's done. Let's do part 3. So if I turn over to this side, you'll see part 3 is here. So we're going to do the same as we did here with the postcard. We're going to place it against piece 1 and piece 3. If I turn it this way around, there's the seam line, and we fold the paper right back, nice and snug, nice and tight. I'm getting my ruler with its little lip, the add a quarter ruler, but remember a standard ruler would work as well. And then I'm just rotary cutting that excess fabric off to make a nice 1/4 inch seam. We can take the postcard away, flip over to the fabric side, and take another one of our triangles, and I'm placing it here, and again I'm lining up that corner to that corner. In fact, if I get a ruler, that helps, doesn't it? Just to sort of, I tend to do it by eye, but sometimes you need a bit of extra help. And these edges are lining up too, and when you think you've got them in place, you can just hold it with your fingers, flip to the other side, and stick a pin in. And the pin's going exactly on that seam line where we're going to sew. Then come back to this line. I can see the faint outline of piece 3 here, and I'm just going to flip this over and just check that it's going right over all the seam lines of piece 3, including that point, and it is. It's going over by about 1/2 inch, plenty of room. So again, I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine, and remember I'm sewing on the paper side from here to here. I'm going to do that and I'll see you back at the mat. So now we have pieces 1, 2 and 3 joined onto our block. We're going to add piece 4. So I'm flipping it to this side, and same process again. We're looking at the seam line between piece 1 and piece 4. Postcard goes along the seam line. The paper template gets folded back along the postcard nice and tight, and the ruler is placed so there's a 1/4 inch going over the fabric, and we trim off the excess, and this just creates the seam allowance to join the next piece, which will be another yellow triangle. And this time you can see we've trimmed off the corners that are still on this side, and it's the same again. We're going to place our triangle over here like this and line up this corner and that corner, take another pin, hold it in place as we flip to the template side, place a pin through it, and I'm going to take it to the machine and sew from here to here. I'm then going to repeat the same on the other side, and we'll sew from there to there. But let's concentrate on this one first. I'll see you at the sewing machine. So I've got the needle lined up at the top of the seam line. We're sewing down to here, and this time we're actually joining the first 2 seams that we've sewn. So as you sew this seam, it will exactly meet this seam here. This is why you need to sew exactly to the lines, not under, because that's where you get your hole. So let's do a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches backwards, and then nice and steady along this line. So the needle's going right through that black line. We're going to take out that pin, check underneath. I find the fabric often wanders a little bit across, so I'm just realigning it. And let's go just about halfway. Leave the needle down. Let's have a look. Check it's not moved around. And then we're sewing right to here, so it will meet this line of red stitches. As I pull that out, you can see if I trim that thread there and there, you can see where those stitches meet at that corner. Same at the top. Just trim that loose thread off. I'll see you at the cutting mat. I'm going to press this one. So now we're ready to add our last yellow triangle. So that's going to be piece number 5. We're going to do the same as we did before, working on the paper template side upwards, placing the postcard on the seam line between piece 1 and piece 5. Right on that line, fold the template paper back. Take a ruler, let's use the square ruler this time. And there's a 1/4 inch of the ruler just going over that edge onto the fabric. And that's going to create the seam allowance rather, to add the next piece. Trimming off the excess. There's our seam allowance. And then if we fold over to this side, we can see that's ready to have the triangle added. So I'm putting the fabrics pretty sides together, right sides together, lining up along this seam allowance edge, and I'm also by eye just lining those corners up. Yep, I think I've got that. Get a pin ready, and we're going to flip this over and place a pin along that seam line, holding those 2 bits of fabric together. And then if I flip to this side, as this triangle comes over, it needs to be covering these lines here. So I'm just folding it over. That would be our seam line. And you can see how we're getting our centre square. And yeah, that's going to cover those seam lines by at least a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to take that over to the machine and I'm going to sew this last square. I'll see you there. So here we are at the machine, and we're going to sew our last seam line to complete this square. So I've got my needle right at the start of the square, and we're going to sew all the way to here, and it's going to join up the very first seam that we sewed. So I'll do a couple of stitches forwards and a couple of stitches backwards, and then following this seam line here, just slide that pin out, have a little look underneath and check these 2 fabrics beautifully aligned this time, playing very nicely. And slowing down as we come to the end, and if you want you can just take this by hand, just turning your wheel by hand there. That's it. I can see I'm going to just 1 over and then stitch back. And as we trim these threads, we should have a square of seam lines. There you can see, no holes, a nice square. And we've got another seam to press, and then to press it out this way. I'm going to do that, and I'll see you over at the cutting mat. So we've got all our yellow triangles around our centre square, and you can see our centre square with the fussy cut, and that bird's fitting really nicely around there. It's very centred in that square. I'm liking the look of that. And all these pieces are a bit bigger than we need, and we're going to do the same process as we did adding these as we add these green triangles. So we need our postcard again, got it here. I'm going to flip over to the template side. So the last piece we sewed was piece 5. So I'm going to turn this round and we're going to work on piece 6. So this is the seam line that we're getting ready to sew, and we've just got to prepare the fabric underneath. So postcard along the seam line, bring the template paper back, and this time as we trim, you can see there's our seam just going up to that point there. The ruler's going over the edge there by 1/4 inch, so it'll be a 1/4 inch away from that seam point. So I'm just going to trim that and trim the excess fabric. And now we flip it over to the fabric side and we get our green triangles ready. Now I'm just going to place these around and work out how I want these to work. I might get some sort of order to it. I've used a text fabric which sort of looks a bit like a stripe as you do it. And I'm just seeing if I can play around with how the stripes are going. I think I like it like that. So that text stripe and that text stripe are sort of opposite each other. And then like that and like that. Now it depends on the sort of fabrics you're using. This is, because it's text, I can see it's got a right way up. And so it doesn't matter too much. I think these look more like a stripe in some ways, but I like them that way the best. So I'm going to spread them out so I can remember. Let's bring back in the one we're working with, which is this one. Right, I'm going to place that against that fabric edge, line it up, and I'm lining up that corner with that corner. I've got my other triangles here for when I bring this back, and so I know I'm going to have them sort of in an order. And just like before, we're going to take our fingers to hold these two bits of fabric together, flip it to the right side. See, that's moved a little bit. I'm going to pin along that seam line. We'll bring it to this side again and just have a little flip over. Now, does this triangle go at least to this dashed line, because that dashed line is the seam allowance, and it's going nicely beyond that to the edge of the paper where we added a bit of extra paper, so that's great. So I'm going to take this to the machine and I'm going to sew from here to here. Now this time I'm going to do that and bring it back to the cutting mat. So you can see the seam I've sewn from here to here, and if I turn it over to the other side, what you can see is you've got a perfect seam point there. And this is really why we do foundation paper piecing, because it does give you these perfect seam points. You can make this block without foundation paper piecing, but it often goes a little bit sort of skew whiff, and you miss your points a little bit, and it's difficult to be precise, and this makes it really precise. So I can see there that square meeting up to this triangle is perfect. So let's turn over and look at piece 7, and I'm going to get the postcard just as before, put it against that seam line. In fact, I'm going to rotate it this way, it's going to be easier to cut. Fold the template back over the postcard, and you can see there's the stitch there. I must have sewn a little bit over there because you can see that stitch pulling a little bit, but it's fine, it's going to stay in place. Get my ruler, 1/4 of an inch over the paper, over that postcard edge, creating the seam allowance. Trim the fabric, and then we'll take, I think it's that one there, was it? Oh no, wait a minute, that one there, that triangle. We're going to line it up along that fabric edge, and I'm lining up this corner to this corner. So I think I've got that in place. Hold it with my fingers and flip over and place a pin along the seam line that you're going to sew from here to here. Let's just check that that's going to cover. Oh, I'm a little short on that side. I don't think I've centered it very well. So I'm going to go back, take that pin out. Let's move that over. I don't think I've lined up my corners. So let's bring it over this way a little bit. That's better, I think. And it's always better to take a bit of time on this, because there's nothing more frustrating than sewing along here with these tiny stitches and then flipping back to realise that actually, you'll see that does fit better this time, if your fabric didn't fit over, if it was a bit short of your seam allowance, or if it's like this, a bit wonky, those little stitches, oh, they're so tricky to unpick, but this one's going to be fine. Right, we're going over to the paper template side. I'm going to sew the seam from here to here. I'll see you back at the mat. So now we've got the two opposite triangles nicely sewn on and two perfect seam points here. Let's add piece 8. So for this one over here, we'll turn it over to the paper template side, postcard along the edge, and it's going along this seam line here to piece 8. We fold back, press along there with your finger. Ruler is going 1/4 of an inch over that edge to create the seam allowance. Trim. And then if we turn back to this side, I've got my triangle already, and I'm going to place it along this edge here, so these two edges are matching up, and I'm just going to eyeball that square and this square. Let's see if I can do it more accurately than last time. I think that's it. Just grabbing a pin. So I don't put the pin in this side because remember this bit's going against the sewing machine bed and need to flip it over, and it's going on this side through that seam line. And we can just flip back and have a check. Yep, that's going to do it. It's going to cover nicely. I'm going to go and sew that one. See you back here. So you can see we're nearly finished. We've got 3 of the triangles on, just this last one to join. So I'm going to flip over to the template side, and the one we're joining is triangle 9. So I'm just going to turn that this way, place my postcard along that seam line for triangle 9, fold the template paper back, and this is the fabric that we're trimming. Place your ruler so it's 1/4 inch over this fabric, creating seam allowance. Trim off with your rotary cutter, and we're going to flip to the fabric side and get this green triangle right sides together, pretty sides together. And we're lining up these edges here and also eyeballing these corners diagonally and making sure they line up. And you can always get a ruler if you're not sure. This way a little bit. Yep, I think I've got it. And a pin. Hold together with your fingers as we flip over this way. Pin in the seam line. And then let's just check and make sure that that piece of fabric is just going to cover up all of piece 9, and it is, and we're going to get really nice sort of framed effect around the square. So I'm going to sew this last seam. Remember that we're pressing each time, so we sew the seam, press the seam, and then open it out and press, or you could use your finger pressing tool or a seam roller. And I'm going to see you over at the mat, and we'll look at how to trim this block so that it's 6.5 inches, because it's a bit bigger than that at the moment, and how to remove the paper without undoing your stitches. I'll see you back at the mat. So we've added all our fabric now. The block is almost finished, it just needs trimming. Let's take a look at the paper side, the templated side, which shows all the seams that we've been sewing. And you can see we've got a square here from the 4 separate seams that we sewed here, and another square here, and it's joined. It looks like a square. There isn't a gap at any of the corners, and that's what's giving us such sharp points on the other side. When I flip over, we can see here we've got these lovely points around here, and we should have them around here once we trim this off. So you can trim it fabric side or paper side, whichever you find is easier. It's probably the first few times you do it, probably easier on the paper side. Some people like to remove the paper first and then trim it. There's no right or wrong with this, it's sort of personal preference. So we can do it using the grid. What you sometimes find is when you've joined, some blocks are made with joining 2 pieces together. Sometimes they shrink a bit as you do it, but this is all one section, so nothing should have shrunk. So we can just concentrate on the lines that are already there. So we're going to just trim around the dashed line. So I'm lining everything up. And you can see if I look at this bit here, there's my point, and this is 1/4 inch away. Yeah, same there, same at the bottom, same on this side. Perfect. And I brought a different cutting mat because this one rotates, which is really, really handy having a little rotating cutting mat like this. Recommend it. And we're just going to trim through the paper and the fabric. And then you see I can just rotate that one round. It's good, isn't it? And we'll go this side. And one more to go. There. Let's look from this side. think that's still a little, I think I've been a bit generous in my trimming there. I'm going to trim on that side and make sure, there we go, just a little bit extra. Right, now you can see we've got our points in there on this side. Yeah, I must have been a bit over that dashed line. Perfect. Now we're going to remove the paper. Now there's a natural tendency just to get ripping off, but there is a logical way to do this. If you work back from the last seam sewn, so the last seam that we sewed was this one here for piece 9. So if we remove this one first and work back, that's going to make the paper come off a little bit easier because it's the order in which the seams are sewn. It works that way. So instead of tearing from this top edge, which tends to put a lot of pressure at the end of the seam, what I really like to do is just tear into the middle of the seam and then tear out to the sides. And that doesn't put the pressure right at the ends of the seams. So if I do the same on 8, and just tear inwards a little bit to the center of that seam and then tear away. This one's going to tear away this way. If there's a little bit left behind, don't worry, you can get that later. Then we'll do 7. I'm going to tear into that line. And 6. And you just keep going until everything is done. So with this one, you just have to get your nail in there a little bit just to lift it away from where the stitches are holding it in. Again, I don't tend to pull from that line because it tends to pull the end of the seam. So I just tear in and then tear away. Feels like a reveal, doesn't it? A bit there, and 3 next. You can imagine if you do a whole quilt of these, there's quite a lot of paper to remove. It does get a bit messy. Oh, that last bit staying in place, isn't it? If you get these bits that really stay in the corners, you can always get some tweezers on them to help just get them out from difficult areas. And we should be left just with the centre square. And we just have to peel that away gently from the seams, a little bit in that corner. So we've got bits of paper everywhere like confetti, but we have got a really nice, neat, finished block. So if you're going to make this a 12-inch block to fit with the rest of the blocks that you've made in take 3, you'd need to make 4 of these. So you could just use the same fabrics, or you could use a mix of different fabrics. You could have 2 like this and place them diagonally and have 2 with different colours going like that. But it depends what you want for your sort of finished quilt. The other thing you could do is add as border to this block to make it a 12-inch block. So either way, you'll have a 12-inch block to finish. Hope you've enjoyed making your economy block using foundation paper piecing.